Good morning. As I was introduced, my name is Ahmed Jahoor. I'm from Nordic Seed, and I'm head of plant breeding and research. And I'm chairing this session, and I decided in this session that all who will speak here, coming from the private breeding companies, to have their opinion, how they think, how they do the breeding. It is my pleasure now to introduce you Piva Eriksen, who is the director of plant breeding site in Denmark. He has been, before he became a director, barley breeder, and he bred a lot of good varieties. And I think some of them, or many of them, know the variety called Sebastian that was really very famous in Central Europe. It was grown in many countries. So, Biva, it is your word.
Okay, good morning, everybody. So we start not very scientifically, maybe, but I want to make some statements. So I will touch on the barley breeding in Europe as a fantastic success story, and talk about pan-European malting barley varieties as the winners. And the barley acreage in EU is under pressure, but the brewing industry will save us. And we urgently need varieties for more complete resistance, and low emissions is the key to success in the future. And high potential yield will always shine across environments. So that's some of the points. So let's get started. And it's divided in the past, the present, and the future, the presentation, because I start in 1992, my first barley genetic symposium in Helsingborg. And there, Fischbeck, I was a young breeder at that time, and Fischbeck made this presentation. You recognize the title. And it made a big impression on me. So I thought we'd just start with a small recap what Fischbeck told us. So the history of barley in Europe, it started with the growing of the land races in different regions in Europe, and then was selection in land races. And after that, varieties was coming out of the land races, and in 2030s, the first crossbreeding was started, and creating the first proper varieties. So that was the start. Next step was intercrossing between important varieties from the different regions. Here, Gol and Binder was into Kenya, a very famous variety, and this intercrossing made big progress. Next, and here you see the pedigree, crossing between varieties from Moravia and Sweden, Binder and Gol into Kenya, and then crossed with UK material, making the variety Proctor. Next step was integration of exotic germplasm, and there was a need for new resistant genes coming from, in this case, from Levigatum, crossed with Gol and made the variety Veda very famous. But these varieties had insufficient malting quality, so there was a need to increase and focus on the malting quality, and that was next step with the mutant breeding coming up with the very famous variety Diamond with good standability, crossed with another line where now there was back crossing, so the malting quality was intact. So we had Triumph, very, very famous variety with improved and very high quality. And the offspring of Triumph, we know it's Blenheim from UK, Prisma from Netherlands, and Natasha from France, Carmen from Austria, and Alexit, very famous also with the MLO gene from a mutation in Diamond. And you see the pedigrees here and the offspring of Triumph. So have a look on the important varieties. This is from Denmark, and here we find more or less also the old varieties, Veda, and we see Velam, Triumph, Alexis, Barke, Prestige, Power, Quench, Irina, Planet, and Laureate, all the famous malting barleys, but also some feed barleys like Digger, Simba, and Evergreen. This is market share, so it doesn't tell about the volume. So in this slide, you can see the acreage of spring barley in Denmark. So it was actually 1.6 million hectares at the time of Elam was grown, but today it's winter wheat came up with better management and inputs, better varieties. The wheat is now same acreage as spring barley in Denmark. So let's look at the present and the varieties, important varieties of today. And I did a survey together with Henrik Maubach from Syngenta. And we looked at multiplication acreage in these countries and made a survey. And here you see from the last 15 years, the important varieties. And you see actually quite few very big varieties and a lot smaller, of course. So let's have a look on these major varieties. And it's Sebastian, Prestige, Triple Quench, Propino, Irina, Planet, and Laureate. So you see that Planet is significant bigger than the others. And in 2020, actually, there was 30,000 hectares multiplication just in these countries. So Planet able to produce 120,000 tons of certified seed, so quite impressive. But another very important varieties in this slide is Quench. You see it's quite big and also lasting for quite a period. So let's look at Quench and look at this pedigree tree and see that Quench is quite important varieties for more or less all the modern varieties of today. This is a display in helium, and the data is provided by Paul Shaw from James Hutton. And it's new data, actually. So let's have a look at Quench. And you see all the offspring of Quench here, and also see that Sebastian is one of the parents. So you have Tam Tam, and then leading into Planet, you have Propino, Irina. So 6, and Quench itself, 6 of the 8 varieties, big varieties, are related to Quench. So Quench is Sebastian Drum in the parent. And looking at Drum, it refers further back to Blenheim, Chariot, and Optic. And all these red varieties are bred by Newfound Crops, later Syngenta, by Mike Collins and Paul Borry. Very important work. But you see on the other side with Sebastian, there's actually a Swedish leg there with Ariel and Goldie. And there's also a German leg with Viscosa. So a little bit like the old story with Fisbeck, that combining different groups of variety creates progress. So quick look at the other varieties. Prestige, you see Cork and Chariot. Tipple have Cork in the offspring, in the parency, and Propino is in the offspring. And here we find for Irina, Quench, Sebastian, Viscosa, and on the other side, Conchita leading back to Viscosa as well. And for Planet, it's Quench on the one side, but Concerto on the other one. And also for the other very important variety of today, Laureate, we also find Concerto. So bringing all this together, you can see that the big varieties are very much related, but there's also very, very important crossing parents in this pedigree tree. You see not at least Cork leading into Tipple, Sebastian, and Prestige, but also Viscosa as mentioned in Sebastian and Irina, and you see Chariot leading into Quench and Prestige, and Tam Tam coming from Quench into Planet, and Concerto, as mentioned, both in Planet and Laureate. And behind Concerto is Westminster, another UK variety, but before that, Barke, a German, important German variety. So very much related. Then we come to next level of varieties, and you see this is more local varieties, and also next level 2,700, 3,500 hectares multiplication. There you see a variety like Boyers and Malz. It's Czech for varieties for Czech malt, and they are quite stable. They are not like the others, in and out in 5 years. They are stable over a long period, but that's speciality. And the last. Okay, how to make such a pan-European important varieties? There you need to get into the industry approval programs for malting barley, and many of us knows the program very good, and it's the IRIS program, it's a MBC in UK, it's a CFMO in France, it's a Berliner program in Germany, and you have the Austrian, or the Czech program, the Danish preferred in Denmark, and Viking malt, and then in Finland, Malting Barley Committee, all involved in approving the new malting barleys. So what is the program for approval? You need 2 years for registration, and then you get into the program. In Denmark, we have a stress test, as we call it, and then there's 2 years for industry test with large-scale malting and brewing, and then approval. And in our system, we need 500 hectares before approval, so that actually means that the companies are very much involved at that stage. We have what we call a stress test with micromalting, same as in Berliner program. And there you see we use 3 steeping degrees to stress the varieties with less water in the malting. And we look at all the important parameters, extract, cytolysis, proteolysis, the enzymes, turbidity, and then make an index. And the index have to be better than the 2 most grown varieties, that's Planet and Laureate for the time being. So we see Flamengo, we see Premis, Thales, Lexi, Flamengo, and Nordic Seed line, and Solar was approved for going into the industry test this year. And here we have the list of approved varieties across Europe. We have from UK, and you see it's actually quite few varieties, so it's not that easy to get the approval. And you have winter barleys there for brewing use, you have spring barley for brewing use and for distilling and for grain distilling. And below you find the Danish list, and here we have the French CBMO list and the Berliner, or the approved varieties in Berliner program. So I tried to put this together with the different stages, with the approved varieties, industry test and pilot test. I did it for the main programs, so for Germany, France, England, Denmark and Sweden. And then you can try to color the varieties in several countries. And doing that, you get a more or less short list of upcomers, of potential new pan-European varieties. So you got Midala from Nordside, Score from Carlsberg, Firefox from Ackermann, Focus from Segobar, you got Thales and Premis from KWS, Lexi, Shetty and Yoda from Brøn, Flamengo from Limmergren, Prospect from Side, Skyway from Nordic Seed, and Solar from Syngenta. So that's some of the upcomers. They will not win all of them. So how to make such a variety? Lene Cruzel at SciIT normally makes about 10,000 double haplets a year, and she will select about 1,000 going into yield trials, and then maybe 100 in multi-location trialing, and then 10 for registration in the different European countries. And then I estimate, and it's very positive, that one variety in 10 years will make it into a pan-European success. Maybe not, but that's optimistic, and make the success rate 0.001%. So, and such a program, it costs 1.5 million euros per year. So normally say to people from the malting and brewing industry that breeders are very naive because they put all the earnings into new innovations to win in a lotto. And but that's the game. Okay, let's have a look at the barley acreage in Europe. It came from about 9 million hectares, and it's now 10 million hectares, and it's a bit downhill. So what will happen? You see that 20% of the cereals in Europe today is barley. Two cases here. Winter barley in Denmark, it's going very much down from 100,000 hectares to 65,000 hectares this year. So what is behind this? It's not about the yield. The yield between winter barley and wheat is the same slope there. So it's different explanations. It's about legislation in Denmark. We need more cover crops followed by swing crops. So there's a competition between what can you sow in the winter for winter crops, and there the winter wheat is high yielding. And also the spring malting has a good premium at less input. So winter wheat and spring barley are the winners. Other example between rye and winter triticale, you see triticale is almost disappeared in Denmark. So why is that? Again, it's not because of the yield. It is very comparable between winter rye and triticale. So here I actually think the explanation is the diseases, because also triticale was used a lot in organic farming, and you see too much mildew, yellow rust, and also yellow rust in the ears. So what about wheat and barley? They come a little away from each other, the two curves, but if you look at the last 30 years, I think they are pretty much equal. So I think in the progress in the spring barley is in a good way compared to wheat. But the driver for the acreage in barley, we know it's industry, malting industry. It's not like all is used for malting. It's 20%, and of that 90% goes into beer and 10 in food and whiskey. So 80% is feed, but nevertheless the driver will be the malting industry with a good premium. And there, here is from Rabobank, looking ahead at 2032 of the beer consumption. It's very positive. Big increase in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and also in Eastern Europe. Not so much in Western Europe. We're drinking enough. And also the inclusion rate, how much barley malt you use in the beer is increasing. Also positive, because we drink more premium beers. So this is a driver, and it's important for the barley. Important is then that also we see that malting barley today have the same yield as feeding barley, not the same as before, where we see Alexis towards Henny was 7 points behind. But today you can use malting barley for dual purpose. What about the quality? Big progress in quality, I would say. This is Schilbach for 30 years purity. He looked at the extract and the extract difference on the modification. Very good progress, and also for proteolysis with Kolbach. And here Ladig is looking at another period of 30 years from the German official trials, and he estimated 1.8 increase in extract, about 20% better friability, 0.06 down in viscosity, very positive, 4.8 in Kolbach up, and not least 2.4% more alcohol with the attenuation increasing. So it's really fantastic work and outstanding breeding achievements, I would say, and it's very important for the brewing industry. We have to watch a little for the hunting the extract and getting more skinning, and also be careful with the high modification and the dark side is it sprouting the germination in the field. But nevertheless, big achievements. And also, I think we'll have a presentation later from Carlsberg, but very good work with the new traits, Null-Lox, Null DMS, and Proant. And we also know with the good work with the GLO-GN and now combining also for the resistant barley yellow mosaic virus with BYDV resistant in the newest varieties. So very good also on the traits with the quality, and we are looking forward to CRISPR to speed up on the trait development. So what about the future? First thing I would mention is Green Deal and the Farm to Fork. So we all are familiar with this, and it means that in 2030, the Parliament thinks that we should reduce use of pesticides with 50%. And also we see phasing out of important fungicides like the triazoles. So we are challenged on the resistance. So I looked at what is the loss with no spraying of fungicides in the Danish trialing. And for 5 years, it's between 2.3 and 16.4% of the yield. And with the varieties, you see the best varieties still lose about 9%. It's Elinor. So it's actually too much. It's an average yield loss of 8.1 hectokilo per hectare, and that means an increase in emissions from 244 to 274 kilo CO2 equivalents per tons harvested barley. So that we have to focus on for 2 reasons: for the farmers and for the climate. So we have to do better with the disease resistance. And if you look at Elinor, the best variety, it's very good in mildew, rust, net blotch, and fairly good in Ramolia, but it's lacking out on the scald. So I think we have to focus on making complete resistant that we actually can cut down on the inputs with the fungicides. So that's one of the focus points. Then the other is about the climate and breeding. And for me, it's very much about the CO2 footprint, and maybe not that much about climate change, also of course, but this footprint is so important. Because global emissions, we see 26% from agriculture, so it's a large number, and we need to do something about it. So, first thing is we have to stop the land use change with the rainforest in Brazil. It's far too much emissions from that source, and also we need more undisturbed nature for biodiversity. So, meaning that we need to increase the yield on the area we grow today, and we have to do better and be more efficient, but also the quality of the commodity for the different industries. There we have to focus on new traits and better quality. So the CO2 footprint for food and feed products is very much depending on the yield per hectare, quality, and land use change. And I have an example here. That's from a feedstuff producer in Denmark, GLG, and they now label this feedstuff for pigs, not just about the crude protein, the fat, and the lysine and all that, but also concerning the footprint of this particular feedstuff. So it tells you it delivers 1.24 CO2 equivalents. So that's a new thing, and that's the way forward. And so this footprint in the feedstuff, where does it come from? It comes from the cultivation. The part from transport and processing is actually not that important. The main source is the cultivation. So that's where the varieties and the management comes in. And we can do something about the quality. If you increase the protein in the wheat and barley in this feedstuff by 1%, then you actually reduce the footprint by 15%. And another example here, if you increase energy by increasing just by 1 feed unit per 100 kilo, then you reduce the footprint by 9%. So it's important for the future. And there you have to look at life cycle analysis for the different food products. And for meat, pork meat, it's actually 50% coming from the foodstuff for the feeding of the the pigs. And in short while, I'm sure this will be labeled in the supermarket, so the consumer can see the footprint of every product. Looking at the beer, it's less in the life cycle analysis coming from the raw material is 70% because the process is much longer. Okay, that leads me to the last slide, and that's an article from Nature, from Frost Phelps, saying that genetic gain for performance under high input conditions simultaneously increase performance under suboptimal management condition. And that, I think, is very important for the breeding industry to remember that the driver for higher yields, for better robustness, is actually the potential yield. And it's based on 200 German varieties and 50 years, and based on almost 20,000 yield plots. So this is solid work. So that leads me to the last point here, that we need to push the yield potential in our varieties at an increasing speed to produce enough feed and food, and also to reduce the CO2 footprint.
Thanks, Birger. I just have a quick question about barley for food. How do you see that in plant breeding? Do we need like a designated breeding program for food?
Yes, good question. I think there's several ways to attack the climate issue. And one is, of course, plant-based food. So we have to concentrate much more on plant-based food. I don't know about barley. It's good in beer. It's a little gray when you eat it, but talk to the Finnish people. They eat a lot of barley.
Just a quick comment on this, because you see from your acreage, at least in Denmark, and I think it's the same in Norway, the wheat is like almost taken over the barley in the land acreage. And that's what my question about, like, do we need like really process?
In the growing of barley, you have some benefits compared to wheat, and that's less input. And you see it now with the high fertilizer prices. That's important for the farmers. But and also with fungicides and so on, it's less input. So that's in favor of the barley.
Hey, so Planet is the top cultivar for the moment. So how much is it in it that it is actually the best one, giving highest yield or whatever, and how much is marketing?
It normally goes hand in hand, because you never get a big variety if it's not also performance for the farmers. But on the other hand, a variety approved by the industry will get grown in much more countries, because you have the intake of that variety. So, but first, a variety have to prove both on quality and on performance for agriculture point of view. Yeah, so it goes hand in hand.
So I guess in an initial phase, very few farmers, they do negative controls where they actually compare different cultivars. So they must be convinced in some way by official trials.
Yes, you have the registration trials in all European countries, and also sometimes running national trialing. So it's based on fact.
Okay, so to drop the carbon, the seed footprint, we need to increase the nitrogen, but the nitrogen in the seed is taken out of the field and used somewhere else. So we need to, whereas the carbon can be plowed back in from the whatever is left of the crop. So how do we increase that nitrogen? Is it all going to be nitrogen use efficiencies, or is it going to be intercropping or rotations that we have to go to with legumes?
Yeah, first we have to go to green fertilizers. We have to produce fertilizer by renewable energy, solar and wind. That's first point, taking down the emissions from agriculture. Next point, we have to look at the laughter gas, because that's the most pronounced producer of emissions. And there we have to look at the inhibitors and also look if it's able to make biological inhibition of the nitrification. It's known from wheat, actually.
The last question from Klaus.
In your trials, I saw that you also have, in Denmark, you have 2-row winter barleys. What's your expectation about the, let's say, the future of 2-row winter barleys in regard to malting barley? That you use it for malting barley?
Yeah, that's a difficult one. It's a good one, but if you talk to the industry, they talk about winter malting all the time, but it's because they want to they want to be able.
I will.
Yes, for them it's important to be able to source barley, and so they want as much as possible. In practice, they are not buying up very much winter barley. They do in France, but otherwise not. But the breeding is going towards malting in 2-row and also 6-row winter barley, no doubt. So it will come, but we don't feel we have the right support from the industry. It's more talk than. Yeah, we still certainly have a lack of quality. But as you saw with the feed barley, spring feed malting, when the quality was stabilized, then the yield came up. And this is the other way around. We have the yield in the winter barley, but now we need to stabilize the quality.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here in front of an academic audience. I don't do that very often, so you don't get that many charts from me. You get a lot of bullet points and some pictures and some smileys and some crying smileys. I hope that's okay. Now I want to start with a question to the audience. Birger did a fantastic job in outlining the challenges for private breeders. Now, what do you think is more challenging, writing a funding proposal or actually private breeding? Like, who thinks funding proposal is worse? Raise your hand. Just one person. No? Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. Well, a big minority, I think. Well, I mean, if you look for new challenges, then okay, of course, private research is always open for applications. So I'm talking then about the one thing that Birger has left out, yeah, the one big headache, and that is IP. And I call this, will the new technologies and also new developments in IP offer a golden age or a dark age for what we do, which is innovation? So, but before that, let me show you a little bit where I come from. So, we are based in Lower Bavaria, close to Munich. The company is called Ackermann. Some of you might know us, I hope. We do almost exclusively winter barley and spring barley breeding, a little bit of soy, just because that's such a nice crop rotation for the future. Yeah, we do that by ourselves in the shape of joint. Oh, sorry, I have to put this slide on. Yeah, I do that by myself or with our company, but also in the shape of joint ventures as part of the Southern Union Group. So, where do we start? I hope everybody has actually done that. Everybody that's in this room actually make a cross. For us, it's sort of a tradition that every new employee actually has to do one cross, irrespective of that's a breeder or not. So you experience what that's like and to ignite the kind of passion to follow up with what you've done, which is to create something new. Yeah, that's what we're all about. I think both in public research, in research institutions, but also in private research. And in order for us to do that, of course, we need the tweezers and a calm hand, but we need much more. And That was 3 years ago. I did a survey with Bill Thomas, who I found out is unfortunately not here today. So if you're watching, Bill, thank you for that nice collaboration. We did a survey asking about, what was it, about 250 respondents on what they think are the most critical success factors in breeding. And of course, there's the access. Yeah, access is provided by the breeder's exemption. It's access by getting genetic resources, and so something like the IT or Convention on Biodiversity is a big aspect of that. Access to new research, obviously from public research, and also now access that might be a little bit hindered through patenting. And it was quite clear at the time, everybody agrees that the breeder's exemption is the sole most important aspect of having this kind of access. And you saw it in the presentation by Birger that if we wouldn't have had that, those crosses between the genetics from various countries would never have occurred at that speed, and we would be in a completely different space today. We would have completely different varieties. And patenting, everybody hates it. Well, not everybody. I think in research, everybody thinks it's slowing us down. But in the industry, the results were kind of half-half. Some were supporting it, and some don't. So this is just to put it out there. Take a screenshot, print it out, frame it in your office, because this is the basis of all of our work today, the actual wording of the breeder's exemption, that you can use any other protected variety to cross for new varieties. So what's so great about it? It's minimally invasive intellectual property protection. That gives you a smiley, so that's good. It's super transparent. It's uniform across all the member states. There is no authorization required, so you just get the seeds legally, and then you can do with it whatever you want. And that's great, because that means no transaction cost. What's the downside of this? Obviously, if you want to do something that requires really a large upfront investment, meaning something fundamental, then up until now, you would rely pretty much on public funding or some shape of subsidized research, which is obviously great for this audience. And I think it's also great for us, because that's how it should be, like fundamental innovations. And I think if you look at CRISPR, that was such a fundamental innovation. All of these things happen in public research, and that's how it should stay. So what does it give us? It's a perfect system to fund private breeding for incremental innovation with no regulation. That's what it is. So what's patenting? It's a prohibitive intellectual property protection. It's you say in German, ein Verbietungsrecht. Yeah, it's like a restraining order, unless you obtain a license. And it's really, really incompatible with the principle of the breeder's exemption. So if there is somebody that wants to cross with a variety that contains a patented element, you can only do that if you have the license. And that becomes then a one-way relationship, because one side can still do it, and the other one cannot do it anymore, cannot access the genetic gain on the side of the patent owner anymore. And that's sort of unfair, I would say. It also comes with heavy transaction costs and liability issues, so be sure to invest in a good patent lawyer. But it is the global standard for intellectual property protection for all other industries. So it's something that means we got to live with it somehow, right? And we have to find a way. it helps you, obviously, this kind of exclusivity that you gain by having a patent will allow you to have more opportunity to refinance your innovations. So maybe that's what everybody says. It helps you fund also significant fundamental innovations. So, in summary, the breeder's exemption is this kind of pooling and socializing of breeding progress, and patenting is quite the polar opposite. So how do we find a way around this? And really a lot of discussions have been going on in the breeding world in the past, mostly in the vegetable sphere. So there is something called the ILP, International Licensing Platform, where patent owners, trade owners, put their traits basically on a shelf, and others, licensees, can access them at defined conditions. And that sort of becomes a club. And that led to the idea to set up the ACLP. So what is it? It's something that's still in creation. So don't quote me on everything I say today. So I put, or as of today, what I say. But I put some excerpts from the website here. So it's a legal framework for all breeders to use to access patented traits, including in the future genome-edited traits. And that allows you basically to achieve the same thing as the breeder's exemption, that whenever a variety is commercially released and you can access it, you can start crossing with it. So it means you obtain a non-assert. You can start crossing with it legally. And then if you decide, okay, you want to keep the patented element in your variety, then you can go to the patent owner and obtain a license. And that license is set at defined terms. I think that's on the next slide. Yeah. There's a standard agreement that is set up that really you need to plug in just one number, which is the royalty. Well, there's one model that you have to define, whether it's on turnover or on seed volume, and you have to put a number there. And the rest is set in stone, and all you need to do is to agree on that level. So if you can't agree, there's even an arbitration panel, so it's the baseball system, where both sides make an argument for a specific royalty level, and then if you can't agree, then an independent arbitrator goes and looks at both proposals and decides which of the two is more close to reality. Very important also in our daily life in the future will be stewardship obligations, and this platform also would help with that by obtaining uniform obligations, at least as far as the track and trace requirements are concerned. Stewardship is not just that, it's also ensuring that there's good agricultural practices with resistance management and so on. So that will obviously have to differ for each trait, but it's at least something. And it provides a fairly good, let's say, lock-in effect. So if you join it, it becomes difficult to leave it, which you could say is maybe a problem, but also it's a benefit. Yeah, it just makes it very stable, and I think that's a good thing. So now I'm doing a direct comparison. I'm showing this for the first time today. So we know what's great. The plant breeders' rights and breeders' exemption. Yeah, we have that across the world, or across the member states, but pretty much across the world. And it just is the most simple way. Then we have the breeders' exemption in conflict with the patenting world, which is just the worst combination. So what does the ACLP offer? It at least offers a partial coverage. It's mostly Europe and Russia, Ukraine, Turkey, in addition to that. It's open to anybody with active research in that territory. There will be membership fees, but I think they will be reasonable, and there might even be some exemptions for small or micro companies. What's really lacking at this point in time is that this platform is not going to cover access to technology. So I think you have to look at these two together. Access to technology and access to naked patents means that by joining that platform, you will only be able to cross with such material. You will not be able to access a CRISPR license, for example, and to apply CRISPR to implement the same trait in your varieties directly. So it sort of creates a kind of, let's say, two-class system where one, which is the trait owner and somebody who has actually the technology access, can operate and breed on a much faster pace than those that merely have the access to the germplasm, the source material for crossing. So this is definitely a big shortcoming. I think the main shortcoming actually, and that, yeah, we'll have to sort out at some point in the future. Access to source material is the same after commercial release, and this is really important. Like I said before, the limited breeders exemption, which is that you can access patented or varieties containing patented traits and cross with them. You just have to make sure either you obtain a license or you cross out that element. That is also provided by joining this platform. So that's a big plus, actually. So, again, we know what's good, what's bad, and how do we make it happen with the ACLP. Again, the access is at commercial release. Again, as I said, the breeding method that is permitted will only be regular crossbreeding. So I think that deserves a little bit of a sad smiley. It allows the use of markers. So when you're a member of that platform, you want to cross in something, you obtain the non-assert, you also obtain the marker information for you to work with, to select for and against that trait. You have the license that is provided at standard terms, a standard royalty mechanism to agree on, and you also have the right to sublicense all of this within the group of the members of this platform. So this helps us in terms of transparency a little bit, because transparency, and I put freedom to operate here as well, just because we will have more ways to find out what's in the genetic or in the commercial varieties that are being released. We have ways to identify what traits will be in there. They will be published on the Pinto database. I don't know if you know this database. It's part of the Euroseeds organization, where you can see varieties containing traits. So you will know much more what you're doing, and you will, if you're a member of that platform, never run into like this murky territory of murky waters of not knowing exactly what's in there, but crossing anyhow. That's, I think, for the future, something that we should stay away from. Again, stewardship conditions will be similar or uniform for the most part. Transaction cost means what does it take for me to join the platform, to obtain a non-assert, to obtain a license, to continue working with such germplasm. And I think it's not like non-existent, but it will definitely make it much easier also for small and medium-sized companies to work with traits. You will still need legal advice many times, and it's questionable whether there's always going to be a balance between those that offer the traits and that license them in. But I think it's a step in the right direction. Clearly, the last remaining gap here on my chart is that there's no rules. There's not even an idea on how to handle the stacking of traits, so multiple traits from various owners, maybe even from members and non-members of that platform within one variety. I think that's when it gets really messy. And I think there is a belief to let the market handle that and figure it out by themselves. But I think we need a discussion on what the principles of stacking and value sharing of stacked traits should be. Okay, and getting to the finish line, the timelines. This is the key element for all of us, especially in private research. How can we make quick innovation cycles happen? So from the release of a parent to the release of the progeny from a variety that, let's say, I crossed and released on the market. And I made this, and this is really a rough assumption, I made it for winter cereals, and I'd say give and take 2 years plus minus. And really, again, disclaimer, this is based on own research and it could be different for everybody. But I think the gold standard is still the breeder's exemption, where from accessing the germplasm to releasing your variety with that germplasm as a parent should be about 9 years. Now, if you did not have a solution for patented traits, and if you would not obtain a license and you would just have to wait, that means only 24 years later, literally, you would be able to release a variety with that trait. And that's obviously a big, big problem. The limited breeder's exemption, which exists, to my knowledge, only in Germany, France, and the Netherlands within Europe today, will already accelerate that. Yeah? You come down to 16 years of that time lag between release of the parent to the progeny. If you had a license, that would be 11 years. So that just shows you that the limited breeder's exemption is a tool that should just be a standard. That should be established for the entire European Union and even beyond, so that is a given, irrespective of the ACLP or not. And if you had then a membership in the ACLP, it would be pretty much the same with the added benefits and question marks, of course, of the ACLP. So, I think I really can't tell whether we're going into a golden age or a dark age. I think most of you know this saying, it depends. So it will really depend a lot on future legislation, such as establishing the limited breeder's exemption on a broader scale, hopefully worldwide. Making sure that the breeder's exemption stays alive, but also working together as private companies. But I think, and that's where maybe some of you come in, make a push for I'm just going to go to the next slide. So that's more important here. Yeah. So the golden age or dark age of innovation can happen if we all work, or the golden age can happen if we all work for shortening innovation cycles. Yeah? That means we need to give each other more access and earlier access to germplasm. We need to share technologies. We need to allow the licensing of naked patents, again, that you can actually employ technology and introgress your traits directly. We need to push for funding for public research, but also for private research. And it's really important for us to remember that also goes out maybe to some of the IP offices in the various universities. You should really only patent something if it deserves a patent. There must be a really, really high bar for inventiveness, because for the rest, at least in the plant breeding world, there is only there is the plant breeders' rights, and that's I think enough to make a return. We need to have a discussion on what's a technology and what's merely a tool. Imagine if tweezers had been patented 100 years ago, where would we stand today? We need to establish the limited breeders exemption for all UPOV member states and realize that the patents really do cause transaction costs. They do cause headaches, but it's a headache we might have to live with. And that headache we might, make a little easier on us if we work on an ACFA 2.0. We don't even have a 1.0 yet, but we're already thinking about what needs to be covered in the next one. So I hope that we can have this open discussion between also not just private breeders, but also including academia, which is frankly going to release probably a lot of traits that might be patentable, and how to make best use of that for the general public, for the farmers, for the breeders, for the research institutions. And I'm happy to discuss this over coffee break or right now. Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting talk. You already mentioned technology. So how do you see the license for CRISPR and the licensing? Could that eventually become part of the ACLP? It's been licensed by Corteva, and yeah. So are there any chances to?
For the moment, the objective to set up the ACLP was to establish this kind of breeders exemption light, yeah, and technology was not part of the scope right now. I think it's up to us, private and public research alike, to push for an open access to these technologies. And yeah, you should raise your voice, just like everybody else here, that this is a tool that everybody needs. And at brand terms, fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory.
Hello. So thank you for introducing me. So today I'm going to talk you about hybrid barley, and especially some key works we are doing for improving the producibility in our hybrid barley program. So when we are talking about hybrid barley program at Syngenta, we mean 6-row winter type. And we are using a CMS hybridization system to produce our hybrid seeds. So this breeding program is quite young, as we first registered our hybrid in 2016. And we are now breeding hybrid for the European feed market with 3 main countries, UK, France, and Germany. And we have a breeding program for each one of these countries. So as we are producing hybrid seeds at a large scale, one of the challenges is to secure the hybrid seed production. And we know that for that, the producibility is really key. So producibility can depend on different factors, could depend on crop practices, climatic conditions, if the plants are stressed, and also genetic factors on which we can work on. So I'm going to talk a bit about producibility, but first I wanted to give you some, explain a bit how we are producing hybrid seed at Syngenta. So we are producing in blend production, so it means that a small percentage of males are blended with a large percentage of females in the same plot, and the wind dispersing the pollen from male and female in the same plot. As I was saying, we are also using the CMS hybridization system, so all our females are on CMS cytoplasm to get a sterile plant. And we are also multiplying this female by the maintainer version. So you probably, you are more talking about maybe B version that are on normal cytoplasm. For the male, they are also on CMS cytoplasm, but they carry a fertility restoration gene, RFM1, that makes the plant fertile. Then, to have good seed set production, good hybrid seed production, the two parental components need to fit different characteristics. So, in the male side, we are looking plants that are taller, that have good anti-extrusion, that have good pollen shading, among other traits. We are also looking for good flowering mix between female and male, for good pollination. And in the female side, we are breeding for plants that are shorter, that have a good seed set, and that are fully male sterile. And at Syngenta, we are especially focusing on these two traits in the female components. So trying to improve the seed set of the female, so the grain filling of the female, and the fully male sterility of this female, using by different molecular approaches. So the idea behind is to use these different molecular approaches to improve the seed set, as I was saying, and to secure the male sterility of the females. And we are doing that at the early generation of the breeding program, because the goal is really to remove or only to promote the materials that have good potential for producibility, in order to have at the end of the breeding program only female with good with a certain level of producibility. So for that we could use QTL of producibility if it exists. We could also use genomic selection approach to predict this producibility, and we can also try to track the female if some are showing some partial fertility, and we can do that by markers. So starting from seed set, we have now started to collect quite a lot of data on seed set using what we call CMS nurseries. So these CMS nurseries consist of females every year that are pollinated with a mix of pollen. And these CMS nurseries, we got 4, so 2 in France, you don't see anything, but you can trust me, 1 in UK and 1 in Germany. And we have this kind of experiment since 12 years now. So every year we are doing a visual scoring for seed set from 1 to 9, 1 being good for seed set and 9 being bad for seed set. So I just put here a picture just to figure out how does it look like. So on the right you have ears with a seed set scoring of 7. That means the plant has not a good grain filling. There are just a few grains on the ear. And on the left, you have an ear with medium good seed set with a score of 3. So from that, what we observed is that there is a variation of this seed set even across location for a given year. So for example, for 2010, each box plot represents the seed set distribution, so you see that there is variation, and you also have variation across years. So clearly there is year and location effect. So from that, we aggregated all this data over years and location by computing BLUP values. So we aggregated everything. And from that, we were able to use this BLUP value on 568 females and run GWAS analysis and to identify one major locus, as it is shown on this Manhattan plot. So here you can see the group of markers that show significant association with seed set. So the markers are mapped in a window for around 2 centimorgans. And when you look at the allelic frequency, you see on this box plot chart that the females, our females that carry the favorable allele on the right, they show in average a better seed set than the females carrying the unfavorable allele. So we are now at the step where we want to validate the effect of this QTL. So we are introgressing the favorable allele in females with poor producibility. So briefly, it consists of crossing a maintainer with poor producibility with a maintainer carrying this favorable allele. We do several backcross to convert this maintainer with poor producibility and now carrying the favorable allele, and we put on CMS cytoplasm to get the female version. Next step will be to score for seed set and to really check the effect of this allele on a genetic background with poor producibility. In the second phases, we will also test cross with a male tester to observe the yield at a hybrid context to see if there is no negative linkage drag for yield, for example. So now, at least with the markers that we already developed, we started to enrich with a favorable allele our female pool to really increase the frequency of this allele. But we also know that seed set is still a quantitative trait. So I just put an histogram to figure out this, and that mimics a Gaussian curve representative of a quantitative trait. So that's why we are also dealing with a genomic selection model to try to catch the part of the variation that could be explained by a minor gene effect. So for that, we are using an additive model, and we can reach an accuracy with such data. We can reach an accuracy of 0.6. So on that plot, I plotted on the y-axis the aggregated phenotypic data, so for seed set, and on the x-axis, the predicted seed set coming from the models. So you can see the correlation between these two types of information. So lower is value, better is a seed set, and you have to read like that. And I also indicated with a red cross a reference line for which we don't want to be below in terms of a seed set. It's really a threshold for us. And as you can see that with this kind of approach, we can already use it to remove materials that have a good prediction for seed sets without too many false positives. So now maybe you would like to know if it's not redundant, this prediction with the QTL information described before. So that clearly there is a high correlation as it is shown on with the bubble. So most of the material in the green bubble carry the favorable allele, and they also show a good prediction for seed set. And most of the material within the orange bubble carry the unfavorable allele and show bad prediction for seed set. But you still have some examples, and I just highlighted few with red dots that show that some material could carry the unfavorable allele, but have a good prediction for seed set, and this is also confirmed if you look at the phenotypic data by itself. So clearly here it illustrates the fact that genomic selection model in our case can be a complementary information to help the breeder for selecting on seed set. So we are now using this kind of approach prediction in our breeding program. As I was saying before, we are doing it routinely at the early generation of the breeding process. So we are predicting seed set when we are developing the female population in order to really remove the material, the bad material at the early stages. And the last point I wanted to show you. So this is second trait we are also looking at. It's the male sterility trait of the female lines. So we already know this RFM1 gene that I was talking about before, that is used in our male to recover the fertility under CMS cytoplasm. And all our females get the sterile allele. But a couple years ago, there was a publication that have shown two genes that were naming RFM3. And they show that they are linked to an undesired fertility restoration under CMS cytoplasm. So these two genes are on the same chromosome 6, than RFM1 at around 3 megabase from RFM1. In the publication, they describe the haplotypic diversity under these two genes. So they show that there is a diversity. So what we did is that we use also exome capture data on a panel of line to try to describe this diversity in really elite material. And here it is represented by this table, and we were able to even identify more haplotypes than the one described in the literature. And what is interesting is that when we put together with field observation, we were able to link with fertility and restoration, fertility and sterility. So for example, in that table, the first haplotype is linked to the fully fertile plants, so all our males. The second haplotype is the one that is most common in our female that are fully sterile. But you see, you have some example of haplotypes that are representative of some females showing in certain conditions a fertility recovering. So they are partially fertile in some conditions. So we are at the step that we need to better understand the effect of these different haplotypes and really try to understand what could be, how do they express under different conditions, and especially under different stress conditions that we could observe in the field, in the production field. So knowing at least the alleles, the partial fertility alleles that we already identified, what we did in terms of implementation is that we applied a strict negative selection using markers that are tracking this partial fertility allele. And here the idea is to get rid of this allele at the really beginning of the breeding program. So in conclusion, as I was saying before, we are using the CMS hybridization system, and the challenge with this kind of system is that we are limited in terms of development of females, because we all know that it's CMS conversion is time-consuming and expensive. So we really need to be smart and to promote only females that have a good potential. So what we did is that we really do a strong selection on maintainers before going into CMS conversion. So for that, you have seen that we increased the selection intensity by removing all these partial fertility alleles in our maintainer before going into CMS conversion. This is the first point. And the second point is that we also increase a lot the selection accuracy by identifying and removing this worst maintainers line using for seed set, using genomic prediction plus QTL information. And the idea is to do it before entering into CMS conversion. And at the end, all of this contributes to secure the hybrid barley seed production in the whole chain. So I finish. I just want to thank you for your attention first, and also thank you a lot all the the people who contribute to work on this topic, so especially my colleague Pauline, Marty, and all the breeders and the people supporting for markers, strategy, and development.
I'll try to do this as brief and uncomplicated. We're moving into genomic selection, and we've already been there a couple of times earlier this morning. I'm going to tell you about what we've learned in Nordic Seed doing genomic selection in two-row spring barley for the last 9 years. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, just saying that, of course, what we want to do with genomics prediction. So with genomic prediction, if we get increased grain per year, we should have a much higher yield coming down 10 years down the line because it's cumulative, right? It's added year by year. We want to increase the intensity of selection by being able to move selection to an earlier stage, we just heard. We want to reduce generation time, also by moving selection to an earlier stage. And for Nordic Seed, this means that we can select in a 5 instead of a 6. We can select among 2,000 lines instead of 350 and a year before. So it should give us increased genetic gain. I'm just going to show you briefly the data that I've got, the models I use, and some of the validation studies that I've been doing. So as I said, we've got 9 years of data. That amounts to 3,145 lines and over almost 40,000 yield plots. I'm presenting results on yield here, but we're doing genomic selection for 20 traits in two-row spring barley. So it's both disease traits and quality traits, and of course it's most important for the most quantitative traits. We have genotypes for all of these lines, of course, and the first part of it was genotyped using a 7K array, and we've imputed it so that we can use all of the effective markers with a known position from the 15K array using Beagle 5. This is a model. We can talk about it in the break if you want. But just to say briefly, we've only got one genomic component in this model, which is the additive effect of line. We also have non-additive genetic effects. And I can calculate the relative variance component. So that is how much each effect contributes to variance among line means, equal to what we know as heritability, narrow sense or broad sense heritability. We can also calculate how much, for example, the G by E accounts for in differences in line means. And luckily for us, a huge amount of the variation in line means when we have lines in multiple locations is actually due to the additive genetic variation in spring barley. That makes it a lot easier to predict using an additive genomic model. We also have a bit of variation that is non-additive. And when we look at what makes a good cultivar, it's the sum of these two. So it's both the additive genetic components and then it's things like G by G. So epistasis variance also contributes to that. But if you want to find the very best crossing parent, it's only the additive genetic variation that actually is being passed on to the offspring. And I do know that if you find a great cultivar, it will probably also be a great crossing parents. And we saw that this morning in the talk by Biwa. But it might not be the very best. It's good, but there may be in your data set an even better crossing parent. So I've done a set of validations to answer different questions. And the first two questions I'd like to answer is how well can we predict when we have a new breeding cycle where none of the siblings has already been in the field and we haven't got yield data for any of them yet. So leaving an entire breeding cycle out of my training data set. The other question I'd like to ask is, once in F6, if we go back and evaluate all the lines that were deselected in F5, how well can we predict the breeding value of those lines? Were there anyone that were deselected that actually had a good yield, but we didn't spot it? And then I'm going to show the prediction ability, and in this case I'm doing it by correlation between the predicted breeding value in the validation set and the actual corrected phenotype when I remove environmental effects. And environmental effects here is location, year, trial. So looking first at this here, can you see? Yeah, it's better on the screen. So if we look at the ability to predict a good line once we have siblings in the training data set, we're doing pretty good actually with the data set that we have now. The horizontal line here is the theoretical maximum correlation. So we're actually doing quite well predicting a line that were deselected in F5 but should have been in the model or in the F6 plots. If we look at prediction across breeding cycle, it becomes a bit more difficult. But it still gives us a lot more information about which line to put into F6 than we had based on just one plot in F5, which is what we have when we come to that stage in our training set. The correlation between a single plot in F5 and then a multi-location yield plot in F6 is around 0.1 in our case. And here we have an average of 0.48. So it does become a lot better. The next thing I wanted to answer is, so if you start your genomic selection program, how many lines do you need to have both genotypes and phenotypes for to be able to do an accurate selection when you have sibling in the data? So this is what I have here. Adding new lines in the training population, a random set of lines, going from 500 in the training population up to 3,000. You can see we have a steady increase in the beginning, and then when we reach just over 1,500 lines in the training set, it sort of levels out. We're doing quite as well as we can. This is compared to how well we're doing when we're leaving siblings out of the data set. Here we actually have 2,600 lines in the training data set. So if that was comparable to just having a random cross-validation, that will bring us around here between these two. So it's really important when you want to see how well can we actually predict to create your training and validation data set to match the question that you're asking. Okay, so the third line of validation, I wanted to do the same thing, but then looking at prediction across breeding cycles. So how many lines and how many years do I need my data set to be able to predict, for example, the last F6 generation that we have in the field last year? And I'm looking at this by predicting the cross that was made in 2017, using first the data from 2020, then the data from 2020 and 2019, and then adding a year going backwards. And what we can see here is that if I have 4 years in the data set, I have around 1,100 lines or 1,600 lines in my training data set again. And the prediction actually stabilizes again. So it's the same number of lines that I have to put into my data set to get a stable prediction of across breeding cycle as when I do a random cross-validation. It's just a lower level of prediction accuracy that I end up with. The last bit of cross-validations that I did is that I said, okay, so if 4 years of data is actually enough, what if we take the first 4 years of my data set, put that into the training population, and then try to predict the following breeding cycles, increasing the distance between the training data set and the lines we are actually predicting. And then adding a number of lines per year to the training data set, of course, except the year that we are predicting, because that's always out. So going from 0 lines, so that's just predicting using the first 4 years of my training data, or adding 10 years, yeah, that would be nice, 10 lines per year to the training data set, up to 300 lines per year in the training data set. And now it gets a bit messy because there's actually a lot of variation in how related each breeding cycle is to the training data set now. So that's why we have huge variation here in the prediction ability. But we can see just ending the collection of training data when you reach the point of 1,500 lines is not a good idea. I don't think any of us expect it to be. Adding 10 lines a year doesn't really help, but when we come up and have around 100 lines per year, it stabilizes, at least in the data set I've got. Now, the variance is still quite high, so we could have years where we would do pretty badly at prediction and other years where we would do quite well. When we add more and more lines to the training population, this variance decreases. So we get a more stable prediction and we get less risk of doing a really bad prediction year. And a word of caution to this, I'm working with real data and not simulated data. So I have 350 lines per year to collect from. If I'm running 60 repetitions, collecting 300 lines out of a data set of 350 lines in total, variants are going to increase, variants are going to decrease just because of that. There's going to be a huge overlap in training set when doing this. So next time I give a talk, I'll have some simulated data sets to validate this with. But for now, this is how I've done it. I've also investigated in what would happen if I take all of the crossing parents that are used in the breeding cycles that I'm predicting here and put them in my training population. That is a good idea, but it's not as good an idea as just having a lot of lines each year that we test. So it doesn't save us. And by the way, the number of crossing parents that we have genotypes and phenotypes for in this data set is in between these two. So it sort of looks as if adding a crossing parent is just as good or bad as adding any random line, which is quite surprising to me. Anyway, in conclusion, I've gone a bit fast because we all want coffee and tea. It's coming soon. So I can spend 7 minutes on this last slide and we can all relax a bit. We still think genomic selection is useful, especially for early predictions. But it's even better for late predictions of deselected lines to see if we missed anything. Now this goes for barley. It might be even more important for winter wheat for other reasons, but that's a different conference. We should, of course, keep updating the training population. We know this already, but we can confirm it in our data set as well. Having parents in the training population is nice for a lot of reasons, but it's not enough. At Nordic Seed, we use genomic selection for early selection of cultivars. That is, for the quantitative traits, almost the only criteria used for very early selection. We have a few mass markers as well. And when we select crossing parents, of course, in the early generations, before we have multiple location yield trials, it's only based on genomic selection. And it also plays a strong role for selection of parents even at later stages where we have advanced trials, because we want to be able to select based on the additive genetic value alone, more or less. Now, apart from the authors in this talk, I also like to thank Lotte Olsen for going around in the fields and scoring, and a lot of other help with spring barley and doing all the crosses. We are eternally grateful. I'd like to thank Henne Svenstrup, who is home at the lab, making sure that we have good quality tracking of our production, and will soon be creating me more markers. I'm grateful for that. And Jus Jensen from Aarhus University, who's been hovering over all of the models that I'm using.
Thank you for your talk and your enthusiasm. The question is, in many parts of the world, the G/E interaction is much larger than what you have there. How enthusiastic you be if you were in one of those conditions with the outcome of the approach, or how much you need to increase the training population if the G/E is much stronger than you have in your case?
That's actually a very good question, because I know we are quite lucky. The correlation, we heard correlations yesterday of about 0.3 between locations. And for me, the genetic correlation between my 4 locations is at minimum 0.76. So a much higher correlation. I think if we can do the same number of plots, I think we could do the same number. Actually, I'm not afraid that the number of individual lines that you have to test is going to increase. The amount of plots that you're going to do is going to explode.
Short question. Now, more short question.
Yeah, here. I have a question about, are you using or planning on using machine learning or deep learning to increase the prediction?
That depends on what you want to predict. Sorry, this is a bit wobbly microphone. I'm not good at using it. But it depends on what you want to predict. If you want to predict a good cultivar, then yes, for at least some species and populations, that could be well worth doing. If you want to select the best crossing parent, I'm not convinced that it's a good idea, because you can't really separate the additive genetic effect from the non-additive genetic effect, and that can create problems down the line. What I've seen is good prediction using different random forest models and the like. When you have the random cross-validation, so you have siblings in the data set, I've seen that being equivalent to the prediction when you have a prediction of G/E interactions as well. When we do a cross-breeding cycle prediction, I haven't seen AI performing very well.
No, it's all right. It's just a quick question. If you use multi-traits for the genomic selection, and if you recommend to use selection index, if you have multi-traits, or you do 2 rounds of selections, if you have 2 traits?
Yeah, so we do have a bit of multi-trait prediction in malt quality. Yes, it can work. It can also be a bit complicated, because every time you add a trait, the number of variances and covariants explode, which has 2 implications. A, it takes a lot longer. So my breeders need to be a lot more patient with me before I can deliver results. 2, we need a lot more lines to do efficient prediction.
Last question may become 2. You said no population structure. Does that mean they're unrelated, or you don't account for population structure?
That might be a bit imprecise. There's no population structure when I do the random cross-validations compared to when we have the breeding cycles, where we have all the siblings in the validation population.
Yeah, okay.
When we look at if we look at just take all the lines and make a PCA, it's a great round circle with everything just in there. So there's not a lot of...
Last question.
And when you say update, is it replacing others, or do you add on?
Add on. I have not yet seen a data set that becomes better by removing. It will happen, but not yet.
Last question. I tried to get the beer this night for asking most of the questions. Oh, that's a different one. Okay, the question is, if you look down the line, here.
Thank you.
If you look down the line in 10 years or from now on or in 20 years, and you have data for then 20 or 30 years for training population, and then you think about G by E interaction, what do you expect is better, to include the data from 30 years for training population prediction, or that you use only the last 4 or 5 years or something like this?
I actually suspect that, I don't know if it's 4 or 5 or 10 years, but there will come a time point where we should stop, so we should call our training population going backwards. And one of it is a G by E. It's also that as we keep selecting, some of the information in the training population becomes obsolete because it's due to alleles that are not there anymore. But I think actually the G by E is the most important, because what will be determined for example, yield, is not going to be the same QTLs when the environment change.